Hi, I'm Ishariz. I am a religious studies educator at Sacred Heart Cathedral in San Francisco, and I'm one of 3 charism animators at our school. I put together this short video to discuss the Vincentian Charism at our school. I will first discuss the lives of our 3 founders, and I will then reflect on how their charism applies to our work as Vincentian educators. Let's start with St. Vincent de Paul. St. Vincent de Paul was born to a poor family in a village far away from Paris, so he had a challenging upbringing. For this reason, he decided to enter the priesthood so he can get some power and influence that would eventually help his family get out of poverty. The priesthood at that time offered some good opportunities for social advancement. Obviously, things were not going to go as planned for Vincent de Paul. Interestingly, according to his letters, he was kidnapped when he was finishing his studies, and he was sold as a slave for 2 years before returning back to Europe. When he got back to Europe, he actually resumed his social climbing efforts, which actually worked for a while. He was appointed to be the chaplain of the former Queen of France and later to the de Gondi family, which was a very influential and powerful family in France. However, while working with the de Gondis and with their subjects, he actually realized that a lot of poor people who lived in their estate were in great need of God. As he offered pastoral care to these people, he realized there was a hunger for spiritual growth, and he felt God was calling him to meet that need. And that's when he experienced a conversion of heart that led him to serve the poor. I told you things weren't going to go as planned for him, and that's when his work began. He founded a congregation of brothers and priests and a congregation of lay people, which was named the St. Vincent de Paul Society after his death. He also helped reform a lot of French priests who had gone into the priesthood, very much like him, in order to climb that social ladder. Now, de Paul retained a lot of the influence he had gained while serving wealthy families in France, and he harnessed that influence in order to help fund his missions towards the poor. His work involved a lot of travel and administration of different communities. And as he worked, he met Louise de Marillac, who was recently widowed and was looking for spiritual guidance. Together, they eventually founded the Daughters of Charity, the order that runs our school. Through his work with de Marillac, de Paul realized that women are awesome at spreading the gospel and serving the poor because they become mothers through grace who care for the poor and the vulnerable as their own children. Thus, de Paul and de Marillac worked tirelessly to serve the needs of the poor. De Paul served as an administrator of the many communities he helped start well into his advanced age, and he passed away when he was 80 years old. One of the things I like the most about Vincent de Paul is that he was very much the man behind the desk. He was constantly writing correspondence and making sure he had funding for the many efforts he was trying to put forth. When I think of de Paul, I think of all the support staff that make my work possible. I think of counselors, librarians, the custodians, administrators, etc. They are very much the people behind the desk that empower me as a teacher to teach my kids effectively. The truth is, I teach with the support of a very Vincentian village. And on that note, let's jump to Louise de Marillac. Louise de Marillac was born in Paris to a wealthy family. By the way, that's how you pronounce her last name, de Marillac, not de Marillac. She went to a fancy school with a good education. She learned theology, philosophy, literature, etc., as well as the trades that were customary for women at that time. While she felt called to religious life at an early age, her family actually arranged a marriage between her and this guy named Anthony Lagrasse. He came from a prominent family and was pretty much a French Prince Charming. So Louise fell in love with him, had a kid with him, and had a beautiful early marriage. However, Anthony Lagrasse died of tuberculosis several years later, and Louise de Marillac fell into a deep depression that made her revisit that early call to religious life. She then looked for some spiritual guidance and was referred to none other than Vincent de Paul. These two clicked really well together, and Vincent recruited her to work on some of his initiatives to serve the poor. And that's how the Daughters of Charity were born. It all started when a poor French girl came to Louise de Marillac saying, "Hey, I want to help the poor as well." Louise noticed that this poor French girl was not really prepared to serve other poor people, so Louise took her in and trained her on how to serve the poor. Eventually, more girls came to Louise de Marillac for preparation to live a life of service, and Louise took them in, forming the first community. Now, this community was not a religious community yet. They were all free to leave and serve however they wanted. So Louise de Marillac established a rule of life that formalized them into the Daughters of Charity. The community eventually expanded and subdivided into different local communities, each with a mother that served as the director. And all these women pretty much became rock stars in service to the poor. The Daughters of Charity served in prisons, hospitals, communities of elderly people, and eventually they opened schools. Their foundress and leader, Louise de Marillac, served with them and died in 1660, surrounded by her sisters. Now, how did this French order get to the US? Let's look at Elizabeth Ann Seton. As you see from the date, Elizabeth was born as the colonies were about to revolt. Can already picture her rapping with Hamilton. Her father was a physician, and she grew up with a stepmother since her own mom died at childbirth. She grew up Episcopalian and had a great education, though she had a complicated relationship with her father as he was often gone. Elizabeth eventually married William Seton, who was practically an American Prince Charming. He came from a prominent family with a great business, and together they had 4 children. Unfortunately, tragedy struck the Setons. Their family business sunk, and William himself contracted tuberculosis. To help William heal, the family moved to Italy, where they were going to be under the care of some of their family friends. But unfortunately, William ended up dying anyways. However, Elizabeth was struck by the Catholic devotion of the people who cared for Will. She then returned to the US, converted to Catholicism, got in contact with US's first Bishop John Carroll, and opened several schools. During that time, her 2 oldest daughters died of tuberculosis, and her 2 youngest sons were sent off to school, but they didn't do so well, so they joined the naval forces. After that, with the help of some benefactors, she started the first religious community. This was a community of women, and they needed a rule of life, so she adopted the French rule of life from the Daughters of Charity. Now known as Mother Seton, Elizabeth Ann Seton translated the biographies of Vincent de Paul and Louise de Marillac, and that served as a guide for the religious communities she just started. These communities had rough lives at the beginning. They lived in extreme poverty, but they carried out their work with zeal and devotion. The communities took over orphanages, schools, and other charitable endeavors. And eventually, Mother Seton died of tuberculosis. That darn tuberculosis! And left her sisters the mission of carrying forth God's work. Today, the Daughters of Charity have over 19,000 women living all over the world and providing direct services to the poor, vulnerable, and marginalized. They also enlist the help of lay people who are called to service. People who adopt the Vincentian Charism are looking for ways to meet the needs of marginalized communities. The open disposition to go where we are most needed is a cornerstone of our community. Also, it is important to know that serving the poor requires the establishment of structures that can operate effectively. Therefore, following the example of Vincent de Paul, while also living a simple life, the Daughters of Charity are very aware of the financial and material resources necessary to promote justice for poor people. So those of us affiliated with the Daughters of Charity are not only willing to serve people in need, but are also equipped to do so effectively, with excellence. As Vincentian educators, we are called to pay attention to the needs of our students and go to where the need is, sometimes to where the greater need is. And those needs must be met if students are to receive an excellent holistic education. And that service takes many forms. Sometimes we have to help tutor a student after school. Other times we have to help them clean up after themselves in the cafeteria. Sometimes we have to staff a registration table or even direct traffic. Heck, sometimes we have to be compassionate towards that one student that knows how to push our buttons. And we are called to do that with a spirit of love. These are all seemingly small, yet very important details that go into the endeavor of Catholic education and charity. And as Vincentian educators, it means we're called to do that work. But finally, and most importantly, Vincentian educators have a deep sense of hope. We place trust in God that our work, however big or small at times, will bear great fruit in the lives of our students here on earth and eventually in heaven.